about how educated are we as Africans about ourselves, and coming to the conclusion that we don't know ourselves, we don't know our history. Here is a major battle. The Europeans meet in Berlin, 1884, 1885, and decide to chop up the continent. 10, 11 years later, Ethiopians win at Adwa, which is in direct contradiction, in direct conflict with what Berlin had decided. Africa must be colonized. The Ethiopians said Africa will not be colonized. Now, I hope all of us know what I'm talking about. The Battle of Adwa. No. This battle was fought in 1896 at the end of February 1896. The Italians, coming out of the Berlin Conference, which you remember 1884-85, which then allocated, divided countries, African countries, and colonized, but not Ethiopia. The Italians thought they want this Ethiopia. And a lot of maneuvers to achieve that objective. And by this time they had occupied what is Eritrea today, or parts of it, and from there wanted to expand and take over Ethiopia as a whole. Now, of course, Ethiopia then is a feudal country. The emperor of Ethiopia at the time of the Battle of Adwa was Emperor Menelik II. Now, before him was Emperor Johannes IV. Now, Johannes IV had warned Menelik when Menelik started talking to the Italians. He had warned him that, you know, these Italians have already occupied this part of Eritrea, and these are not people with whom to form a friendship, because what they're after is taking over Ethiopia. We lose our independence. Emperor Johannes died, Menelik became emperor. And he was responding to that, the attempt by the Italians to take over Ethiopia, to colonize Ethiopia. So the Battle of Adwa, as I say, end of February 1896, is a battle to ensure the continued independence of Ethiopia. That Ethiopia shall not be like all of these other countries which had become colonies of the West. I do hope that there would be some book that all of us would be available here in this country for us to read about this, because it's a fascinating story of leadership. Professor Muchi was saying that one of the problems that we have, a curse we have, is this weakness of leadership on the continent. It's absolutely extraordinary to read about this, because Menelik, for instance, the Ethiopians had been fighting battles. They'd fought battles against the British, against the Egyptians, against Sudan, against the Italians, and so they were sensitive to this fact that to defend the independence to guarantee the independence of Ethiopia, you had to deal with these possible interventions. And two matters were critically important. One of them was the unity of the Ethiopian people in defense of that independence. And I'm saying it's fascinating to look at this and to see what these emperors and feudal leaders, royal people did very conscious about the need to maintain the cohesion and the unity of the Ethiopians about the matter of the independence of Ethiopia. For instance, as part of that, there was a schism in the Ethiopian church, a theological schism, division. Now, this is a very Christian community for centuries. And the emperors understood, Johannes IV in particular understood, that if you allow this division in the church, it's bound to impact negatively on the unity of the population as a whole. So we need to deal with this. Now, example, so they sorted the matter out in terms of theology and all that, but Emperor Johannes made a comment which today makes you a bit. He said one of the things that needs to be done, if there are any continuing heretics in the church, you must cut off their tongues so that they must stop talking nonsense to the people. But I'm saying this was the idea of maintaining the unity of the Ethiopian people so that they can act in unity against any foreigner who wants to take away their independence. The second matter was they'd understood that you needed to be properly equipped with weapons. And so you have a very interesting situation as they are quarreling with that's the Ethiopian monarchy, as they are quarreling with the Italians, they were busy building very good relations with the French, with the Russians. The point that was made here by Professor Schobier about even in those early days, diplomats, emissaries from the African continent interacting with the rest of the world. The consequence of which was that the Ethiopians were able to arm themselves with modern weapons. And that unity is very important because the war that the Ethiopians had to fight against the Italians had to be carried by the people as a whole. It's not a matter of there's a professional army which must fight another professional army and the rest of the people is standing by. No. Because you've got the figure that's given is that the Emperor Menelik had managed to mobilize the people who actually went and confronted the Italians at Adwa were something like 100,000 people. Who really literally it's an army that must live off the land. So the peasants must supply the food, both for the people and for the animals, the horses and so on, and the donkeys that are carrying things. So the whole nation is united behind this. And they defeated the Italians at Adwa in 1896. And I want to read you some things that were said. From the white side about that famous victory. For instance, a report appears in the Times of London at that time from their correspondent was in France. And he wrote that no one here that is in Paris, I have not to take notice of this or that scatterbrained person. But he says no one here wishes for the success of the Abyssinians at the price of the discomfiture of a civilized nation, from which it is quite possible to differ in aims and opinions without being supposed to cherish any ill will when that nation is face to face with a brave but barbarous foe. Johannesburg Star, That's on the 5th of March, 1896, that immediately after the defeat of the Italians. The Johannesburg Star said the utter and crushing defeat represents the most disastrous check which any European power has received at the hands of the natives for years past. It cannot but be deplored by white men in all parts of Africa. It is far from impossible that this great defeat may have even larger consequences than a temporary check to civilization in Africa. At least the Star then had some sense. And the Cape Argus, on the same day, 5th of March, Cape Argus from Cape Town said, Italy is bound to carry out to the bitter end her policy in Abyssinia. Menelik must be crushed at any cost. And meanwhile, Italy will have the keenest sympathy in her latest troubles. That was the view of white South Africa. Its sympathy with Italy in her latest troubles. There's a George Barclay who wrote about this and said that from the broader standpoint of politics and history, it seems possible that the Battle of Adwa heralds the rise of a new power in Africa. We are reminded that the natives of that continent may yet become a military factor worthy of our closest attention. The suggestion has even been made, absurd as it appears at present, that this is the first revolt of the Dark Continent against domineering Europe. And the French historian spoke in London on the 4th of March, and he said the defeat of the Italians by King Menelik is an event which you should keep in your memories. It is the waking up of Africa to meet what has been hitherto the disdainful seizure by Europeans of those countries which we call barbarous. It must not be forgotten that in many of these countries now reverted to barbarism, there formerly existed an extremely advanced civilization, and that Ethiopia in particular enjoyed throughout Africa great renown for its refinement and wealth. Since then, it is true, he said, the isolation of tribes and peoples, the difficulties of communication and superstition, with all its attendant ills, have gradually brought about the decline of a portion of that region, the hidden riches of which were now so widely coveted. And the lecturer said the invasion of that country was too rapid, too precipitately undertaken. Everywhere, Africans without distinctions have been treated as so many cattle to be branded with the owner's mark. The Italians have been not less courageous or less enterprising than others, but they made up their minds a little too late, and when they also went to Africa to get their share of the African fortune, the easily accessible regions had all been taken up, so that they had to be satisfied with regions not open to the first comer. And he said the battle which has just taken place was a logical issue of events. From the moment that the Italians were in possession of Massawa and Kassala, the way should have that Massawa in Eritrea and Kassala now in Sudan, Eastern Sudan, the way should have been either to make a friendly alliance with the king or to crush him and obtain a solid foothold. But a mistake was committed. He was treated as a savage. It had not yet been understood that they had to deal not with barbarism, but with a dormant civilization now awakening and reappearing before the world. And just when the Italians flattered themselves that they had subdued the king, he was preparing to prove the contrary. His victory is that of all Africa, and this point of view will gradually become patent. In these countries, where news traverses the deserts As on the wings of the wind, you may be sure of the wind. You may be sure that from one corner of Africa to the other, it is already known, or will be so tomorrow, that Africa has conquered Europe. And throughout those dusky myriads, there will be an awakening up to life and to an attitude of defense. This is the reason why this whole business is so serious, and why nothing heedless than to rejoice at the defeat of the Italians. That defeat is also ours. It is a defeat of others. It is not that of civilization. This, as I've just told you, is a mistake. But it is that of colonizing Europe, that of the Europe of tomorrow. This is a Frenchman giving a lecture in London, understood that the Italian victory, the Ethiopian victory at Adwa against Italians was an African victory, and says that beware, you might look at Ethiopia rising, but in fact it's Africa rising. Let me just tell you, in the Battle of Adwa was preceded by many other conflicts with Italians. And some of it took place in 1895, October 1895. The General Baratieri, Italian, who attacked Ethiopian troops and defeated them and occupied certain points which were later, during that offensive on Adwa, were taken back by the Ethiopians. This General Baratieri, having got his glorious victory, returned to Rome. That's 1895. And on his return, he was hailed as a hero and received a standing ovation when he addressed the Italian parliament. And the Italian Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of Italy at the time, was a man called Francesco Crispi. And Prime Minister Crispi described the Ethiopians that had been defeated by General Baratieri as, I quote, barbarians whose material progress and spiritual salvation cries out for the high ministry of Roman civilization. And Baratieri, addressing the parliament, promised the Italian parliamentarians that he was going to bring Emperor Menelik, this barbarian, called him the barbarian. This barbarian Menelik, I'm going to bring him to Rome in a cage. A few months later, the Italian forces were defeated at Adwa. No Menelik was ever brought to Italy in a cage. And the Italian left Africa in disgrace. That is Adwa. Professor Mamomuchi talked about a book that we thought we were going to write. There's a colleague of mine who said, I don't know where he is now, Mkon Rachtang. I wanted to embarrass him. Or is down there? You know, I'm about to finish, Bruce. Looking at this problem about how educated are we as Africans about ourselves, and coming to the conclusion that we don't know ourselves, we don't know our history. Here is a major battle. The Europeans meet in Berlin, 1884, 1885, and decide to chop up the continent. 10, 11 years later, Ethiopians win at Adwa, which is in direct contradiction, in direct conflict with what Berlin had decided. Africa must be colonized. The Ethiopians said Africa will not be colonized.